Hello and welcome to Seattle City Makers. I'm your host, Jon Scholes. Welcome everybody to our latest episode. I'm joined by Michael Berne. He is one of North America's leading experts and futurists on urban and downtown Main Street districts, as well as the retail industry in general. He's a principal with MJB Consulting and has amassed more than 20 years of experience conducting retail analysis across the US, Canada, and the UK. And he was in town not too long ago during the International Downtown Association's 70th annual conference, which we were fortunate to host here in Seattle. They hadn't been here for 30 years, and Michael and 1,400 plus of his colleagues in the place management and downtown business enjoyed a few days in Seattle. And I was able to catch up with Michael, who was presenting on a few panels and in town for that conference, which was just terrific to hold. It was great to see our city through the eyes of city makers and place managers with the International Downtown Association, who to a person just had a phenomenal time in our city. And I don't think they were just being nice to me. You could tell they just really enjoyed their time in Seattle. So Michael and I sat down and discussed his take on Seattle's retail core and some of our opportunities and challenges. He knows our city well, having passed through here a number of times before. He splits his time between Berkeley and Manhattan. We discussed some national retail trends, retail-tainment, and the move to locate larger concept food and beverage and activity recreation operators in some of the larger spaces that were vacated by more traditional retail. Michael was on the ground in Seattle and out and about in our retail core, so it was helpful to get some of his time and get his take on the challenges and opportunities in front of us. And we discussed the return of PCC to downtown, which was news that broke just as we took to the podcast and we're starting our recording. PCC announced their return to downtown Seattle with a smaller format store and some additional office space at the corner of 4th and Union in downtown. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Michael Berne, founder and principal of MJB Consulting. Thank you for doing this and making time amongst a busy conference for you. I know you were speaking yesterday.
Yes.
I want to talk about it because I unfortunately had to miss it because I had to go down to City Hall, but our great producer, James, took a great notes. So James was there. And you've been writing a bit and want to talk a little bit about that. But how's your time in Seattle been?
Great.
And I know you know our city well. You get through here quite a bit.
Yep. I was here just this last April. So it's a good comparison to just 4 or 5 months ago.
Yeah.
So but I always love coming up here.
And I just have to say I'm coming in on a high because literally 5 minutes ago, I got a call. This is serendipitous. This is breaking retail news in downtown Seattle. It doesn't break till 11 today, but this won't post for a bit, so I think we're safe. But PCC Markets, which left Seattle,
right?
What was it? Less than a year ago.
Yeah.
Will announce that they're opening they're going to take over a third of that space and reopen it for grocery, and then take the rest for their offices that they're moving into downtown Seattle.
So they're taking back.
the
entire floor plate.
The entire floor plate at
and
4th and University, between University and Union.
And so how much square footage for the grocery store itself?
It'll be a third, so I don't know what that ends up being. I think that original, I don't want to put a number out that's wrong, but a meaningful amount of grocery and all the stuff that did really well. So
that's terrific.
Yeah.
That's great news for downtown.
Yeah. So I know you're watching all kinds of openings and announcements and pivots, especially in the food and grocery space. You wrote recently about the Whole Foods small format,
the Whole
right?
Foods daily shop.
That's what they're calling it?
Yeah, that's what they're calling it. And, they're starting with, I think, 5 locations in Manhattan, but they have been explicit that it's the beginnings of a national rollout.
Yeah.
Presumably, Seattle would be pretty high on that list, given its downtown residential population and the fact that obviously it's Amazon owned. So, that's an exciting development. For downtowns across the country.
So what's been your impressions of the state of Seattle's retail relative to other markets you spend time in, and just sort of national trends and everybody that's fighting and clawing back from a challenging pandemic?
Yeah. So, obviously the metro is, I think it's still below 3% vacancy, right? And that's kind of across the board nationally. Market for retail space hasn't been this tight since
Is that
early
on
aughts.
paper vacancy? Versus, so people walk by and they see empty storefronts, but sometimes, and you call it, dark spaces, I think what you refer to them, where there's still folks paying rent, but there's nobody in it, right?
Yes. So
sometimes people have 3%, and why do I see all these storefronts that are empty?
Right. Well, and those numbers often are, the national numbers, which are, produced by major brokerages, using a subset of the overall inventory, right? So, and that subset's probably weighted towards, larger shopping centers. So, it shouldn't be taken to mean that, 97% of the retail space in this country is full, because we all know that's not true. But it is the tightest it's been since the aughts. As it turned out, the market finally came back into equilibrium because we have built very little retail space since the Great Recession. And so, we've always been talking about how we're over retail in this country. Well, at least in terms of those numbers, you can't make that, can't necessarily make that claim. Obviously that varies on where you're talking about. If nothing else, the changes we've seen in the industry have affected different types of different formats and locations differently. In certain ways, the rich have gotten richer. The stronger centers have just gotten even stronger with kind of a flight to quality.
Similar to the office sector.
Yes.
People are going for the higher quality experiences,
Class A,
environments.
Class A plus sort of product. Yeah, it's similar in retail. Downtowns were obviously impacted by the pandemic, arguably more than any other sort of geography, other than, Class B, C malls, which have been struggling for a while. And downtown Seattle has not been immune to those trends. It's interesting, when I was in a session led by Tracy Hayden Lowe from the Brookings Institute, and she made the point that, the downtowns that have struggled the most were the ones that had the furthest to fall. And so to some extent, it's a come down from a very high level.
Yeah.
And before the pandemic, I believe I was here with you. I think it was February 2020 in the same Hyatt Regency Hotel. I think it was a State of Downtown event.
That's right.
Right before
That's
the pandemic hit. And I remember I even looked at that presentation or my remarks, and the vacancy rate there in downtown, I think retail vacancy was below 2%. Which is arguably too tight, right? I mean, you want a little more vacancy than that. But now I think it's like at around 14%, right? Is that between 13 and 14?
Probably on paper, but if you walk around, right, you're going to see a number that's probably higher than that. And there are numbers, those dark spaces where are sort of being worked out in some form or fashion.
Right. And, and there have been some high-profile closures, some large vacancies. That is not unusual for a downtown that has historically been such a shopping destination like Seattle. Seattle has fared a little better, for instance, than Union Square in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Even though Union Square in San Francisco is even larger in scale in terms of total square footage, still has more of its department store anchors. And yet, Seattle, downtown Seattle, still has a number of retailers that have left Union Square. In that sense. But yeah, I mean, I think what's been happening, there's a few things that have been happening, if you want me to go into that.
Yeah, please.
I think, obviously, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was just a severe contraction in consumer demand, right? I mean, and I'm not so much talking about the office workers. The office workers have...
You think that's been overstated. You've written,
I do.
And I think you talked about that in the session yesterday,
Yes.
as I understand it, that the effect of the office worker on retail in downtowns is overstated.
Especially in the kind of retail that defines downtowns, right, as shopping destinations, right? I mean, it certainly affects, the office canyons. And you see where your primary driver of foot traffic is the people working upstairs, right? But when you're talking the shopping core, like when you're talking Pike Pine between 3rd and 6th, I would maintain that that's far more affected by, one, visitors, and two, by residents, not just of downtown, but the near neighborhoods, for whom it is the most convenient shopping destination. And those are the two primary markets. And early pandemic, obviously, visitation collapsed, right? in 2020, at least, there was a short-term flight of residents, which reversed very quickly in almost all downtowns across the country.
We saw it here. First time in decades to see a decline in the number of people living downtown. What a quick correction.
Right. And but I think it was that initial contraction, and then and this is somewhat my theory, but like that, then the foot traffic, what's been on the street, whether it's mentally ill, drug addicted, unsheltered homeless.
The disorder.
The disorder, which has always existed at some scale, but it certainly became more visible when there was less foot traffic overall, and then that started to feed a narrative, which was kind of inflamed by the nature of politics in this country. Now we're in an election year. The media certainly did its part, the national media. Seattle brought its own unique flavor to it with the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone.
Yes, we did.
Yes, but this is a phenomenon that's been happening across the country. So then once that narrative starts to ossify, the retail leasing community, especially when you're talking national brands, they are inherently risk averse.
Yeah.
And so it kind of cascades from there. But there's also a few other things going on, and two other important factors, I think, which I've talked about a lot. One is that I believe there's also a bit of a changing of the guard in retail. The brands that you and I grew up with that were just considered fixed points in the universe, right? They've been on the outs for many years. Some have started to recover.
What would some of those be? So, let's see if we were wearing the same stuff.
I'm not saying I was
Gotcha?
wearing these things.
Remember Gotcha?
Yeah, I remember. Yes. But if you look even at some of the brands that have closed here, Macy's, Banana Republic,
J. Crew.
I
was wearing plenty of that growing up.
I wasn't wearing Barney's clothes.
No, I didn't have a lot of Barney's.
No.
There wasn't a Barney's in Tacoma.
There wasn't a Barney's in Tacoma?
Yeah.
Okay.
Still isn't.
Those sorts of brands, they kind of lost their relevance. And indeed, in the late part of last decade, they started to really struggle financially, and kind of moved away from the large flagship store, but people grew up with them. When we see them closing, we naturally think, oh my God, the sky's falling. This is a retail apocalypse. But what we might not have been aware of is that there's a whole new crop of brands that are extraordinarily popular among millennials and younger. And a few legacy brands have also remained relevant. I don't want to say it's a whole, there are many exceptions. But like there's these newer kind of brands that have really kind of resonated with a younger demographic, and they're the ones expanding now these days, and they don't want 20,000 square foot flagships.
And some of them may have started and exist exclusively online with plans to be brick and mortar, but don't have brick and mortar yet.
Right.
Yeah.
And to the extent that they are opening physical stores, they are gravitating to somewhat smaller scale neighborhood shopping streets or kind of newer mixed use districts. So, and
smaller stores themselves.
Yeah, and small stores themselves. And you see some of them in Pike Pine. You see Warby Parker there. You see Marine Layer. You see Glossier, right? Now
on Capitol Hill.
And Capitol Hill, right. Now, and frankly, if there hadn't been the whole chaos of the autonomous zone, you might have seen more there.
Yeah, they had some momentum going up there.
Yeah, they had some momentum.
And hopefully we'll regain it.
Right. And I think that for a little while, though, if you were such a brand, you might have ordinarily gravitated there. Instead, you might have looked closer at University Village, instead. And there's a little bit of it in South Lake Union, not as much. I mean, there's a West Elm there. Sephora is also in downtown. There's Sephora up there. But, that's kind of, we've been seeing that nationwide. So I think that's going on. And the last thing I'll mention is two of the major workhorses in downtown retail leasing for years have now been going in the other direction and closing lots of stores. Large format drugstores.
We've certainly seen that here.
Yeah, I mean, Bartell closing, right?
For different reasons then, but.
Yeah, but it's and that's happening across the board. Walgreens closing, Rite Aid in bankruptcy. Even CVS, the healthiest of the three, is also closing stores. So, and they've historically been one of the major space eaters in our downtowns. And then bank branches, because of the rise of mobile banking. Even the banks that have branches still, they're about half the size.
When was the last time you were in a branch?
Exactly.
Yeah. You can't remember, can you?
No.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's also been going on and not gotten as much press, I think.
So you're saying then it sort of floods the inventory with spaces that used to be sort of taken by credit tenants that would be occupied for 10-year leases with options. And
even worse, some of them are still paying rent on those spaces, but they're dark stores.
Yeah, little incentive for anybody to move on
and me as a landlord, I want to keep that because, if they're probably paying rents of circa, 2010, 2015?
Right, so if you go back into the market, you're losing money.
Yeah.
So you said the U word, University Village.
Yeah.
They're thriving.
They are.
Is it true that most lifestyle centers like them in other parts of the country, sort of adjacent to downtowns, are doing very well? And some of that was happening pre-pandemic, but certainly those places seem to have weathered the storm better than our downtown cores.
Yeah, I think there's something during that period of massive disruption caused by the pandemic. I think they were able to seize the moment because, they already it's interesting. You can see it through a counterfactual. Okay, so if you take Center City, Philadelphia, great example. They actually on Rittenhouse Row, in Rittenhouse Square, have all of these cool younger brands. But the reason that is such a, that's an exception to the rule, right? But the reason they have them is twofold. One, it's that odd sort of downtown shopping street, which is smaller storefronts and more neighborhood scale because it is a function of 19th century Philadelphia, So that's one piece of it.
They have the historic advantage.
Yeah. And then the second piece of it is that if you look at throughout Philadelphia, which is a city of 1.5 million people, there's really no alternative. There's no other neighborhood shopping street or even lifestyle center with sufficient co-tenancy to compete as a location. You either locate on Rittenhouse Row or you locate King of Prussia Mall,
the
all the way in the suburbs.
Yeah.
And this is a huge city and metropolitan area. So Rittenhouse Row basically has all of Philadelphia, or a lot of Philadelphia, to itself, which is, there are some neighborhood shopping streets that have become hot there, but mainly with food and beverage. They don't have the co-tenancy.
Yeah.
So that's the counterfactual.
So they've got some unique dynamics there. But when you look across other metros with downtowns and lifestyle centers, those centers are there and doing pretty well.
And they're doing well. Yeah. I mean, you could see it. Exactly.
Yeah. And every time I go to U Village, I don't want to like it, but I do because they've just done such a great job. And what strikes me is they and other lifestyle centers are really mimicking this urban downtown shopping experience. They just don't have tall buildings on top of the stores.
Right.
But the small storefronts, all outdoor facing, walkable, clean, flowers, tables and chairs. In some ways, they're doing downtown better than some downtowns. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's tough for the downtown world because people who work in historic downtowns, they could see how it's just a facsimile, right? And they say, well, it doesn't have the patina, the personality of a real downtown, which is true. For most people, those nuances are not really all that important, right? For some people, they are. And for some people, it'll be like, I'm never going to shop at University Village. I'm going to do all of my shopping in downtown as a principal. But, we know
a lot of those people, God bless them.
Only go so far.
God bless those people.
Yeah.
So what advice would you have for us as we sit here in Seattle and we face some headwinds? We've got more openings than closings, certainly, but still some folks that are in a fragile spot and some bright spots too. I think Ben Bridge told me this week that John Bridge let me know that their numbers are better than they expected and better than their Bellevue store right now with the flagship they opened here in downtown Seattle. I know Uniqlo is outperforming their projections. So there are some really strong performers and bright spots, but we've got a fair amount of vacancy.
Yeah, no, the vacancy is still very much there, and part of it, and we can get into the session I did yesterday, which was on this subject, is about particularly the larger vacancies, but
meaning larger spaces.
Yeah, larger spaces, right?
Yeah. And we have our share of those.
Yeah, and I can get to that in a minute, but I think in general, I'm cautiously bullish about downtown Seattle, and I think there's a few reasons for that. One, yeah, you still do have some incredibly important anchors, most notably Nordstrom, right? But also there are still some strong brands here. Anthropologie is still here. I'm going to mispronounce it. Arc'teryx.
Mm-hmm. You got it.
And
a new brand out of Colorado that I can't pronounce.
Oh, yeah,
Himalaya. What is it, James?
Himalaya?
Himalaya. That took the old Arc'teryx space, or
right.
former, yeah.
Arc'teryx, arguably, to be honest, I wasn't entirely sure why Nike left downtown Seattle, because I would think they'd want to be amidst all these other, activewear.
So you're surprised, not that they closed a 25,000 square foot store, but they didn't reopen the 9,000 square foot store in downtown and instead opened it in Bellevue.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I was, I just feel like they would still need to have a presence amid, in this.
Yeah.
In this submarket too. But I'm cautiously bullish because I do think, in as much as the two main drivers for shopping, shopping in the core are visitors. Visitors are close to pre-pandemic levels at this point, especially, out of town visitors, and only going to grow with some of the investments that have recently been made.
You made the point in your session yesterday, because James took such good notes, about the significance of foreign visitors and that they haven't returned to pre-pandemic levels. And there's certain sort of sub-markets, especially travel from China.
Yeah, China.
Which was a big segment, and growing segment here.
Yeah.
And how important they were to downtown retail.
Yes, they're huge, and that's not talked about enough either. I mean, if like San Francisco, Union Square, San Francisco, it hasn't even reinstated the flights
right
to and from China. Right. So even if they wanted to come, and they're having their own economic challenges in that country, even if they wanted to come, they couldn't. So and that's huge. Yeah, probably not as huge here in Seattle, but still meaningfully. A meaningful chunk. So the foreign tourism, but ultimately that will, I imagine, be back in full force. Seattle is, you can just see in the attendance at this conference. Seattle is almost equal last year Chicago, right?
Yeah, we're claiming we beat Chicago, because here's what went down in Chicago. The city of Chicago paid for 50 registrations. So,
Okay, so you almost beat. And you're saying open.
So we did not subsidize registrations here. So, Chicago politics. We're not using the word corruption, but
no, because that doesn't happen in Chicago.
Yeah, it's fishy.
Yeah.
So
but
strong demand to be here.
Seattle
cool.
is and will remain a draw. And then your central city residents are continuing to grow. And as much as those are your two main markets, And
when you say central city, are you thinking of the residential base that exists within the sort of traditional definition of the downtown, or people within a couple of miles of the downtown?
I'm also including people within a couple of miles, because the way I think of the population, a lot of downtowns just think of it as just ending at downtown's borders. I think of it in terms of retail trade area, and I say to myself, okay, if you drew kind of a polygon to reflect the residents for whom downtown is the more convenient shopping destination, that's kind of the population I'm worried about. And University Village certainly takes a little of that, but Bellevue is much further afield. And then what else? From a shopping destination in terms of co-tenancy, even now, what else really competes? And Seattle is not a small city. And it's, its population's only growing. And so, to me, that's how I think of it. That the downtown population, as impressive as it is, you also have a lot of these neat, close-in neighborhoods that you can rely on to some degree.
And the way I think about this is, like, you've got to be able to compete with the other choices people have, the people being those that live sort of within 5 miles of the core. And even with the strong hospitality business we have here, visitors from other places, even with the strong residential base within the downtown of 100,000 or so, if you can't compete and be the most convenient and desirable choice for the folks that live within 6-7 miles, you're going to struggle. And
I agree.
And I think sometimes maybe we overstate or overthink the significance of the 100,000 people that live downtown, which are phenomenal. But we've got to be able to still draw in from elsewhere. And that's as we emerge from this pandemic, certainly one of our challenges in downtown is we're just not seeing the same frequency of folks who live within 10 miles coming.
Yeah, and I read that you said that in, like, I think it was a Seattle Times opinion piece, and I thought that was very interesting. That, like, the out of town tourism seems to be
just about back to where it was in 19.
Yeah. But what's still missing, and a lot of that is whatever reality and or perception about the conditions.
The last several years.
Yes.
The news stories and headlines and images.
And that's you know, it's not uncommon for visitors to be less deterred by that than the region.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Regions aren't always the best ambassadors for the downtowns,
sometimes we're
right?
our toughest critics, right? Those who know and love and have seen a place evolve and change and go through ups and downs, and you
have a different you have a different relationship with it. The psychology
for
is
sure.
different. This is my downtown. This says something about me and the place where I live. And I don't like what it's saying right now. And people coming from the outside aren't necessarily seeing the same thing.
Yeah, very true. It's been
or aren't preoccupied with it.
Yeah, it's been refreshing to just feel the positive energy of 1,400 folks that are in town this week, enjoying themselves.
Yeah, it's and as a Gen Xer, Seattle has a special place.
Yeah,
just because of that's when it really hit the big time, and
So we were talking about large format stores, 25,000 square feet and above. I don't know how you would define it, maybe 10,000 and above.
Yeah, I mean, it's I would. For the purpose of this conversation, we could say like 10,000, because then you catch drugstores.
Yeah,
you know.
So do you think that model, that scale is dead forever, and no one should bother trying to fill those spaces and cut them up, do other things? Do they come back in some form? Throw into the conversation question retail-tainment and those concepts, which seem to be hot right now in a lot of markets and are occupiers of big chunks of space.
No, certainly the pool of potential tenants for those size spaces is a bit shallower than it used to be right now. That said, I think there are still a number of retail brands that seek that space. Uniqlo being a perfect example, but they're just one of many. I will underscore in particular that there's a lot of international brands that see this as an opportunity. Might be saying, why is America suddenly so down on its downtowns? This is the time to get in. We see that in San Francisco, IKEA, now with a store, right in Union Square. Yeah. They don't only have a store; they bought a 6-story mall and are tenanting the rest of it. Here in Seattle, Uniqlo, H Mart has a store in downtown. They're seeing American downtowns a little differently. So I think international brands offer an opportunity. And also, I'm skeptical that the move away from flagships is permanent. Because I just feel like in a clicks and bricks world where customer acquisition online is so expensive, because basically you either have to pay Facebook or Google. Well, I'm sorry, Meta or Alphabet.
Right.
It's an oligopoly, really. The price to advertise online is incredibly steep. Customer acquisition and retention, there's been a kind of a move back in the retail industry to understanding the role of bricks and mortar in getting and keeping customers. And, where can you do that most effectively? In downtowns with with high levels of foot traffic.
Yeah,
because
density matters.
Yeah,
economy of scale, lots of eyeballs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm a little skeptical that turn away from large flagships is going to hold. I just think in a clicks and bricks world, those are essential pieces of the puzzle. Macy's just announced they are leaving Union Square in San Francisco. It's a move that makes no sense to me. And they should know.
Selling? Do they own the underlying
They
real
own
estate?
the real estate. And so it makes sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me for two reasons. One, they're going to be selling into a down market. So I don't see where the real estate play is. But more importantly, Macy's of all companies should understand the importance of flagships. I mean, they generate much of their profit from their Herald Square store. They need that. Macy's more than ever because they really need to communicate that they're a different sort of retailer, because what they've been doing just has not been catching hold. How are they going to do that without flagship stores? So I'm not convinced. Now, will this turn back happen quick enough for existing property owners? Maybe not. But yeah, I don't think we should give up on those spaces just yet. Having said that, there are other sorts of, like you mentioned, the eatertainment and the entertainment concepts. Two caveats about them. Some of them, like Second Story.
Why is that?
I think it's just Second Story is usually half as expensive as ground floor. So if you're if you need 25,000 square foot space and you're a mini golf,
and you're going to have people there for
beverage.
A good amount of time.
Yeah, and it's kind of a destination use.
Yeah.
You can go on the second floor. Also, I think there will be some shakeout. I don't know, and I said this yesterday, I don't know how many mini golf food and beverage concepts are out there now, but they're not all going to survive. So there's going to be some shakeout. But yeah, they are definitely looking.
Do you think these things? Do they fizzle out? I mean, or do they work in certain areas where you've got a lot of tourism, visitor, and convention traffic where people are going to take part in that? It feels like if you're a local, how many times are you going downtown to play mini golf at the new retail-tainment space?
Right. I think it's visitors, and also they do make a decent chunk from corporate events.
Yeah.
And so that's another reason they like being in downtowns. And I don't think they're going to disappear. I think it's more that there'll just be fewer operators to choose from. I don't know if you need 6 or 7 different mini golf concepts.
Yeah. Are there concepts, retail-tainment concepps that catch your eye beyond the mini golf? I mean, are there ones that stand out? There are some that feel more unique or novel than others. There's one called Flight Club, which you might have heard of, which in the end is basically a concept where the gimmick. All of these are really food and beverage purveyors, and they use the way to sell alcohol.
Yeah,
right?
Way the interactive play as a gimmick to get you in the door to buy alcohol. And Flight Club, their gimmick is darts, and so I'm like, well,
darts
wait a second,
and alcohol. Yeah.
How? Wait, we've had that for a long
axes.
time.
Yeah, we've had axes and alcohol.
Right, we have axes, and that has had remarkable staying power. I got to say, I'm surprised there are still as many axe throwing.
And they still are able to get insurance, apparently.
Yes, yeah. I don't know how they ever did, but they seem to have reduced their.
So we could go on, and this could be a 2-hour conversation because you've got so much, and this is such a critical topic in downtown Seattle, like other downtowns, and I think downtown retail's always been hard, as you will certainly agree, and downtown Seattle could claim as one of a few that we had a pretty healthy retail core and mix, and so
incredibly strong, and I think there are reasons to, again, who knows what the future holds, but there's reasons to be cautiously optimistic about downtown Seattle. I wouldn't say that about all downtowns.
Yeah.
So
we no doubt could carry on for another hour or two, but we have like sessions and master talks and business to get to. But I want to conclude with our 2 standard questions we end with. What was your first job?
My first job was in college. I don't know if this brand existed here in Seattle, STA Travel. It's an Australian brand. It was a student travel agency. So they had all these discounts on international flights that they could offer students.
Yeah.
And they were in a bunch of university towns. If they did exist in Seattle, it would have been in the U District, right? Because that's where the locations tended to be. Mine was in the student union of my university. I thought it was really fun, just to think about going to all these places.
Yeah, you get a dream while you're working.
Yeah, exactly.
And then what's your perfect Saturday in Seattle when you're in town? Or what have you been up to the last couple of days, however you want to take the question. But if you got a day here, what are you doing?
Okay, well, definitely coffee features prominently.
Mm-hmm.
I do love coffee, and Seattle does very well in that space.
Do you have a favorite shop in Seattle? Favorite brand?
I have been enjoying Monorail.
Yeah.
Espresso. I'm a fan
Amy
of
Peck's
that.
great.
Yeah.
Former guest.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm a fan of that. But there's just so many options. It's just an embarrassment of riches here, and it's been for so long. So it would include coffee. I would say I'm kind of an architecture nerd, and I find Seattle's, especially its historic fabric, I just love it. I mean, just walking around, it was Pioneer Square, Pike Pine. Just seeing those early 20th century buildings, I eat that up. A Mariners game. I'm a baseball fan, big baseball fan. I was saying to James, even though I am a long-suffering Mets fan, I have like kind of a secondary sort of fandom for the Mariners, have for a long time. The ballpark just looks beautiful on TV. I got to get to a game there. And then finally, something in the outdoors, and the reason I ask, somewhere west in the outdoors, I think, I've always been in love with Pacific Northwest scenery, and ever since Twin Peaks, which I know was not supposed to be in this part of Washington, even though it was filmed nearby. So it would include that too.
Those are good. Those are good activities.
Yes.
Yeah, we didn't talk about Pioneer Square, but another interesting retail district that.
It's evolving in an interesting way.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to walk around there like on a first Thursday?
Yeah.
Is it when?
Yeah.
And it was hopping. So it was exciting to see. Yeah.
Well, thank you for making time for this.
Yes. Michael. Thank you for inviting me.
Duties and whatnot.
Yeah.
Always appreciate your perspective and reading you on LinkedIn and some of the other places you show up, and look forward to continuing to learn from your wisdom and knowledge of what's going on in other parts of the country as we try to continue to revitalize this great place and our retail fabric. So thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Well, hope you enjoyed my conversation with Michael. I always appreciate the opportunity to sit down with him and pick his brain. He has a tremendous perspective on the state of retail in our downtowns and Main Street districts, and incredible knowledge of what's happening and what's coming. So thanks again to Michael for taking some time out of his conference schedule to come on Seattle City Makers. You can follow Michael and his writings on his LinkedIn page. If you connect with him there, he's always sharing his well-researched and informed perspective on the state of retail. I want to close out with a recommendation of something you got to check out in downtown Seattle, and I want to highlight the soon-to-open new Tutabella in the Wren apartment tower at Fairview and Denny. Joe Fougere and his team are soon to open the doors to a more upscale Tutabella, an expanded menu, terrific space, a longer wine list. I got in there for a little tour this past week, and it looks terrific. Looks like they should be opening later October. Joe's also opened Social Fabric in the same ground floor of the same apartment tower, Wren, at the corner of Fairview and Denny, which is coffee, sandwich, and market and baked goods. It's a terrific space. And then one additional operation in the lobby of Wren is the Lobby Bar, which is open to residents there and the general public. And invite you to check out those three concepts: Tutabella, the Lobby Bar, and Social Fabric at the corner of Fairview and Denny in the gorgeous Wren apartment tower, which opened, I think, earlier this year. So go check that out, and congrats to Joe and the team at Tutabella for what they've got going in downtown. Well, thanks for joining us on this episode of Seattle City Makers, presented by the Downtown Seattle Association, with support from James Cito and production by Spark Creative.